Today we tell the story of a man who went from being a Tennessee Circuit Court judge and circuit riding preacher to a mountain man and cold-blooded killer. Hello folks, I'm Steve Gilley along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia. And as always, be sure to go down below, click that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Be sure to ding the bell too so you'll get notified every time we have a new story out. And if you don't mind, please give us a thumbs up too.
Well, Steve, I know another interesting story that we're getting ready to tell people, but you know, it I guess it kind of rings true about Appalachia and the way things were. You could be a very good man at one point or another. It seemed like you were a very good man, but once you were seduced by the dark side of, lawlessness, it kind of turned you into a different kind of person before it was over with.
Well, that's kind of what happened in this case, and moonshine was the culprit, I believe, in this one.
Yeah, another one of those moonshine stories of declaring and just dragging those poor souls down to hell with them, I guess, isn't it?
Oh, my goodness. Well, let's move on with the story. And the story is about a fellow named Green Allen Brooks. And in his younger days, Mr. Brooks lived in the area where Claiborne County and Hancock County meet. There he got a job as a teacher by the time he was 20 years old. Later on, he became a justice of the peace, but this was only the beginning for this ambitious young man.
Well, during his life, Brooks not only was a teacher, but he became a circuit-riding preacher. Now, he would take his sermons, and he would go into the hills and hollows of Tennessee and Virginia, around the Tennessee-Virginia border, the area where the Melungeons had settled. He was also a traveling salesman, too, visiting the same places where he preached to sell his wares. He owned a small store, too, and probably the crowning achievement of Mr. Brooks was his claim to being, get this, a circuit court judge in Hancock County from 1877 to 1893. Now, that's a claim that we've not been able to verify, but we're just throwing that out at you for you to understand at least kind of where the story is going in this, okay? But Green Allen Brooks had certainly accomplished a lot in his lifetime.
Yeah, he and his first wife lived on a 100-acre farm he'd bought in the Hopewell community. After his wife died, he apparently found it just a little bit too painful to continue to live on his land, so he sold it to his son Ira, and he moved to Kentucky. And in Kentucky is where he met his second wife, Sally Hensley, and the two of them soon moved to Lee County, where Brooks bought another farm in the very far western part of the county near the Kentucky line at Cumberland Gap. He also went into business in that town. Well, after he retired, he devoted himself to two things, Rod. One, running his farm, and two, moonshining, which
of course,
I guess goes pretty well with farming, depending on what you're growing. Well, Brooks made and sold shine for years, up through Prohibition and the early years of the Great Depression, and the money he earned on that kept himself and his wife financially stable on that Lee County farm.
Well, by 1935, Steve, he had gotten quite a reputation as a moonshiner and a rough mountain man. And he was one of those mountain men that played loose with the law, with his long white beard and his black hat that he wore. But in the summer of 1935, all that caught up with him. Because on July 18th, 1935, Green's son-in-law, Luther Poor, had gotten himself into, well, let's just say it, a pickle. Okay? It appears that he had allegedly embezzled some money, and a warrant was out of Bell County, Kentucky for his arrest. Two Lee County Sheriff's deputies, 45-year-old Arch Redmond and 58-year-old Robert Bailey, well, they had a notion that they'd find Poor at his father-in-law's farm near Cumberland Gap, so that's where they decided to go looking for him. The lawmen arrived at the house. They found Luther Poor there, arrested him after a chase through Brooks's cornfield, finally catching him after they fired 3 shots at him. But all was not yet over, Steve.
No, it wasn't. As the two men were leading Poor away to their police car, Green Allen Brooks, preacher, salesman, and former judge, grabbed his rifle, stepped out on his front porch, and, taking careful aim, shot and killed the deputies. He then slipped out the back door of his home and fled to the mountains right behind his house that marked the Virginia-Kentucky border. Meanwhile, having been alerted by folks who'd heard the shooting, the sheriff's office got the loan of bloodhounds from La Follette, Tennessee, with which they swiftly organized a posse and went on a manhunt. The dogs led the men to a cabin on the mountain where they lost Brooks' scent. It was speculated from evidence on the scene that Brooks had gotten on a mule at the house and headed on into Kentucky, most likely headed toward Harlan. And with that, Rod, Green Allen Brooks completely vanished.
Vanished?
Mm-hmm. Like,
wow.
Boom, he was gone.
Well, over the next year, law enforcement officials followed up on every clue, no matter how small, leading them to places all over the Southeast, one of them being Atlanta, Georgia, where it was thought that Brooks was being held on unrelated charges. Well, after a check of the man's fingerprints, it was then determined that, no, he wasn't the fugitive from Lee County after all, but it also helped that the man's age had turned out to be about 45, so it was much too young for, well, Green Brooks. Soon, there was a real tip from some Texas lawmen, you know, those Texas Rangers down there in the great state of Texas, that turned out to be worth its weight in gold.
It turns out that Green Allen Brooks had made his way out to Lubbock, Texas, then enjoying an oil boom. There he took the name Reverend John H. Jones and went back to his earlier profession as an itinerant preacher. To pay the bills, Brooks/Jones was working in a restaurant in Lubbock when he was discovered. In March 1937, Lee County Sheriff R.F. Giles went to Lubbock and positively identified the now 80-year-old mountain man, yes, he was 80 years old, by the gold crowns on his front teeth. Even though the old man denied he was Brooks, he signed extradition papers stating that he was willing to
go anywhere to clear my name.
That lasted until the ride back home to Virginia. Sheriff Giles had decided to not talk with his prisoner, letting him think things through. Suddenly, Brooks sat forward and told the sheriff that he couldn't hold out any longer, that he was Green Allen Brooks, and then he asked about his family.
How's the old woman and the two girls?
Once locked up with the other prisoners, Brooks gladly admitted who he was, what all he'd done in his life, and that he'd profited from the manufacture and sale of shine, although he told the other men in the jail with him that he took the wrong road because of the temptation of easy money from the sale of illegal whiskey. Roddy also bragged that he taught the largest Sunday school class in Lee County. He also enjoyed, get this, dancing a jig to the music played by one of the other prisoners, which the other men found entertaining, and I guess I could see that.
I also like the wording in there because of he took the wrong road because of temptation of easy money from the sale of illegal whiskey. That reminds me of being a member, or at least being around Otis Campbell. I saw temptation coming, but it saw me first. Yeah, okay. Well, for the upcoming trial, Brooks hired only the best lawyers he could find. His team consisted of State Senator Floyd Robinette, W.L. Davidson, former Commonwealth Attorney of Lee County, and R.L. Pope of Knoxville, Tennessee. Brooks went on trial for the murder of Deputy Robert Bailey in Jonesville in May of 1937, the first of two separate trials. And there he put on quite a show, playing the lovable old hillbilly as best as he could. Now, he regaled the courtroom with his biography, his being elected circuit court judge in Hancock and Union counties in 1877 and serving until 1893. And remember, we're still checking that one out right there. But he talked of teaching school in Tazewell, then going on to become a salesman for a woolen mill in Cumberland Gap in 1906, and finally running the dry goods store in Cumberland Gap between 1918 and 1922. He also repeated his boast of teaching the largest Sunday school class in Lee County, Steve.
That must have meant a whole lot to him, to be honest with you.
It must have, yeah.
Well, he also freely admitted he shot the two deputies. According to Brooks, when he saw those officers fire at his son-in-law, then run him down and arrest him, he took action.
I saw that there were two of the officers who had raided me at least a dozen times and had given me a bad deal. I thought it was time I did something to keep them from hurting Luther seriously and possibly endangering the lives of other members of my family.
Well, Sheriff Giles testified that Brooks was preaching in Lubbock, Texas, under the name of Reverend J.H. Jones, and had been proclaiming that he had sinned greatly but had been forgiven. Now, those statements had raised the suspicions of local police, who did some investigating and realized they might have the infamous Green Allen Brooks in their midst, prompting them to contact the Lee County Sheriff's Department. Well, after all the evidence was introduced and both sides argued their case, the jury began deliberations. On the afternoon of May 22nd, 1937, they returned to the courtroom to announce their verdict. Not guilty.
Not guilty?
Not guilty.
Well, I'm sure pandemonium erupted in this courtroom, didn't it, Steve?
It did indeed, especially at the defense table, as handshakes and hugs and all kinds of happiness took place.
Wow. Well, let's move on to the next trial, and that's for the murder of Deputy Arch Redmond. On September 20th, 1937, the next trial got underway with Green Brooks pleading self-defense. This time, Brooks testified that Deputy Redmond had pulled a gun on him, threatening to kill him and members of his family, prompting Brooks to go and get his Winchester and shoot him. Now, prosecution witnesses testified that Brooks had threatened to shoot Redmond and Bailey before for interfering in his moonshine operation. Well, that case went to the jury later on in the month, and this time things did not work out so well for Green Allen Brooks.
No, they didn't. He was found guilty of manslaughter in the death of Deputy Arch Redmond and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Now, keep in mind, this is an 80-year-old man, so 5 years could just very well be life in prison. His counsel decided not to appeal, and he was taken to the state penitentiary in Richmond to begin serving his term. What do you think happened, Rod?
I guess he probably ended up serving so many years and they let him off for good behavior, mainly, I guess, because of his age, too, something in that general neighborhood.
Yeah, something like that. He served 2.5 years, and the governor pardoned him for good behavior. How many times have we heard about governors pardoning all these murderers in Appalachia?
Yeah, well, I don't know. That's few and far between, Steve. That's what we can say about it, I'm sure.
Well, after he was pardoned, he returned to his family and his farm in Lee County. Mr. Brooks passed away at his son Ira's home at his old place in Hopewell, Tennessee on October 12th, 1948. So there you go. Another little crime story from a very interesting little character.
Well, you mentioned La Follette in this. Now, this is this the La Follette that's north of Knoxville?
It is.
Okay, that's what I thought, because when they had to send for the bloodhounds or send for the hounds to start looking around for him, I just thought, La Follette, that sounds like it's pretty close to where, all this stuff was going on. So it wasn't a bad idea to do that. But, very interesting story here that he went and he essentially lived what could you say, a double, triple life, so to speak, of, a circuit court judge, if you want to call him that, a preacher, and a moonshiner, all three. Wow, talk about a life. That was it.
Well, we talk about a lot of these folks that do bad things and then turn their lives around. This is the exact opposite. This is a guy that apparently behaved himself for quite a few years, and then once he got up there in age, did a backflip and started doing all the bad things.
I reckon you could say the devil got a hold of him and drug him down the pathway.
Possibly so, possibly so.
Yeah.
Well, folks, that's the story of Green Allen Brooks, preacher, judge, moonshiner, and killer of 2 lawmen. Another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Now, you can subscribe to the audio version of the Stories podcast at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Audible, Odyssey, Spotify, or if you don't like any of those, just subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Till next we meet. So long, everybody.
So long.